Hi, folks. Welcome back to On Call with Insignia, where we go on call with leaders innovating the future of Southeast Asia's internet and digital economy and beyond, or as we like to call it, ASEAN Innovation. I'm your host, Paolo Alquino, and we are here with a very special guest, somebody who I had the chance of meeting as of this recording, a few weeks ago at the Japan Southeast Asia Market Forum, which is a great gathering of different founders, corporate leaders, executives, innovators, people from all across the region who are very much interested in strengthening Japan, Southeast Asia, the innovation corridor. I met our guest there and had a quick chat, really interested by his background, his journey, going from investment banking to starting a venture debt fund and all of those things, and now very much active as well, looking at startups and innovation and things like that. Very happy to have with me Abe-san, who is the MUFG Chief of Staff for APAC. Thank you very much, Abe-san, for joining me on
Thank
call.
you,
You're
Paul.
having a good
Thank you
day.
for having me.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, and you're dialing in from Singapore, which you call your home and office for this particular role. But you've had quite the extensive career across many geographies and across many different functions. Maybe you can share a little bit, since our podcast and our show is really about startups and venture. What was the first role you had where you were exposed to the venture capital asset class and investing in startups?
Yeah, thank you again for having me. This is my 29th year with the bank since 97. My first encounter actually was at Stanford. So I was there, the GSB Graduate School Business for 1 year executive full-time program. And I graduated in 2013. So there was Eric Schmidt, other prominent investors that I didn't really know. And because I was sponsored by the bank and kind of knew I was coming back to investment, large corporate banking, so I wish I had learned more about all these startup ecosystem and how that works. But I had a very good exposure to the whole community and the culture, how they connect with each other, and how these elevator pitches work as we learned about it, experienced it throughout our class. So that was my first closest I got to these investing, honestly. And the next 10 years, I was away from it. And then we decided to go into India, setting up a 300 million startup fund. So I was involved in establishing that. And then years later, we started establishing another external joint venture fund, which is growth fund and the equity. So I later on ended up being the CEO of the equity investment fund. And so around 2020, my commute to India started. I've been on stage, attended all three GSS, the Global FinTech Festival in Mumbai. And this year, I switched that over to, of course, Singapore FinTech Festival, where I met you. It's been a great journey, but really my intensive exposure really has been the last 5 years.
It's been quite a journey. You've been with the bank, as you mentioned, 97. That was around the time when I was born. So it just puts things into perspective for me, at least.
Right.
It's been quite the career. So you had those periods where you were at Stanford, and then you set up the India fund, and then now you set up Mars Growth. Throughout that time, I guess obviously you weren't as involved in it through most of it, only the last 5 years, as you mentioned. But what have been your observations in terms of how Japanese banks like MUFG, their role in like the whole venture and startup ecosystem globally?
Yeah, I think as the largest financial institution in Japan, our larger thoughts behind all this is how do we keep supporting the Japanese economy and to extend it to APAC, really. So if you look at it, Japan itself has gone through industry cycle. We started maybe from steel making to shipbuilding to electrics to car making. And there's this concept of long-term employment. So there was little room for the youngsters to jump off to starting up their own company. Really wasn't a thing until, I don't know, 5, 10 years ago. But then we thought, okay, as the economy matures and then the industry cycle goes on, now it's a good thing that all these ASEAN countries, other markets are booming with manufacturing and all that. How Japan should continue its growth cycle, right? And we said, okay, hold on. Think about post-war economy. Sony, Honda, these really they started as really a startup, small
Mm.
company built by younger generation. So I think it's a common understanding and goal, supported also by the government, I think, that we should support the startup ecosystem in Japan, as well as then if we look just outside, then look at how invigorated the ASEAN plus India South market is. I think it's natural that Japanese companies started then to think about the CVCs and then to search for opportunities, either domestic or outside Japan, to support these up and coming startup, which would bring you the technology, the new industries, and most importantly, the growth that we as matured economy is lacking, partly
Mm.
because of demography and all the other reasons. But it was, in a way, very natural for many of the large Japanese corporates and investors to look outside, look at the growing economy. If you look at GDP growth, the demography
Mhm.
is so important, right? And then, so as we did that, I think the Tokyo Stock Exchange and other government policies, economic industries did a good job of then really trying to change the Japan market itself to focus more on these new up and coming opportunities and support them with the new market, new stock market, inviting the ASEAN companies to list in
Mhm.
Tokyo Stock Exchange. And of course, that was the main purpose of the event that where we
Mhm.
met
Yeah,
this year.
right. Yeah. I think with the movement of these institutions like Tokyo Stock Exchange, I think it completes kind of the pipeline that MUFG has been investing in over the years. I had a quick follow-up question because I'm curious. You mentioned about the India fund, which you were in charge of. With respect to investing in startups outside of Japan or looking at the startup ecosystem outside of Japan, well, was India the first kind of fund that you started internationally, or what was the first fund internationally that you guys set up?
We started off setting up fund CVC fund in
Mm.
Tokyo, which does look at US and all other
Mm. Got it.
external markets as well. Being a CVC, this is mainly for the purpose of growing collaborative opportunities. So naturally, they would tend to be fintech, right? And so they are now into number two, number three funds, right? So that's that. And then we also did a Ganesha fund, which is the 300 million India fund, which had
Right.
a little bit different perspective. So we said, okay, because it's a fund, okay, the economic return is important. But then this is one way for us to jump into not commercial banks. So not another commercial bank in India per se, although we did invest in commercial banks local in Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines. These are all good demography, good GDP growth. Next obvious choice, one of that, of course, is India, right? But we jumped over to next stage of finance, which is fintech. So we invested in also in Ganesha Fund, but outside of that, DMI is another consumer finance company that we invested 10, 20% now. And the thought there was, okay, maybe we can enjoy the growth together, or we can learn from the new technologies, the new market, and bring it back to our home ground, Japan. And one other important aspect was helping them bank the unbanked. So, for
Mm.
instance, this situation in this particular DMI company, half of their customers were new to finance, new to credit. So, they either had no bank accounts or never had a credit line, credit card offered to them. So, this is what the device finance. So, let's say Samsung phones, right? So, this was their first chance to experience and get the access to these finance history, if you will. That sort of transferred into other market as well. So we are now have now set up a Garuda fund, 100 million
Mm.
in Indonesia as well. So those are the sort of the investment fund. But also, again, we also invest directly to other fintech companies like Gcash, Home Credit, and in many cases, these are for learning again the up and coming way of finance, fintech, and then also even in turn helping out the wider population within the economy. And that should work for us eventually because of course we are invested in the retail network, local banking institution in those economies. So I think in a larger scale, we are there to, in the long-term vision, and to help out these population economy, then back to partner entities as well.
So I think really investing in the demographic dividend of these like emerging markets, and also I think the technology dividend as well. I think a lot of value there for a bank like MAFG over the years. And the reason why I asked this question about the motivation for the CVC is because I think it leads into the spin out which you became CEO of, which is the Mars Equity and Mars Growth Capital. And would love for you to share a little bit of what was the thinking behind that versus just sticking to the CVC game, and how what value does it add within the broader ecosystem of MUFG's investments into innovation and startups?
This is not just investing, but also a lending part as well. So Mars
Right.
actually started out as a debt offering. So we saw a niche that no one else offered, which is non-dilutive. So we didn't ask for warrants or part of the equity, but I saw that there was a demand for a growth financing. Of course, in this growing economy, if your revenue grows 50%, 100%, then multiplied by 20x valuation, right? People are eager to get that funding and grow their business right before IPO, but then not dilute their own holdings. So I think we found that a good opportunity there, and combined with the liquidity is our partner company. And this was really AI before AI became a thing. But basically, it crunches numbers and sometimes initially real-time connection into your CRMs, your bank accounts, and then there's an automated scoring, right? So that's 60% of the decision making. The other 30%, 30, 40 is the expert judgment, right? So once the information is shared, we typically can offer you the term sheet in 20, 48, 72 hours, right? So it really helped us increase the speed of the decision making and communication. So it really worked well for the clients as well. So it started in the middle of COVID at 80 million, became 200, 500. So now it's a 1 billion commitment fund, single LP by MUFG, no losses over 4 years. So that's been a great story. So we then said, okay, went so well, let's do equity offering as well. So that's the Mars Dragon Fund 500 million offering. And that also employs a little bit of that AI engine. And then this is not just fintech, but we invest in B2C companies, insurtech. Oftentimes, on both debt and equity cases, what we can offer is the network into our existing client set, as well as our existing licensed partner banks in those very important demography in Southeast Asia. So that's one. And then let's say if you're a fintech and serving other financial institutions, right? We can connect you to existing industry standards, governance, and all. So that's a window into existing ecosystem and network. I think that's what we offer. We actually also started that in Americas as well. You would remember Silicon Valley Bank saga, but during that weekend or week, our head of Americas, Kevin Cronin, happened to be traveling on the West Coast. He heard about the news. He went over, shook hands with the team. So we have now onboarded about 30 of ex-Silicon Valley Bank team who is offering what we call emerging tech debt offerings as well. They continue to offer their knowledge, their Sand Hill Road connectivity,
Right. Yeah.
knowledge, all that. So there, we're trying to really be the connection between up and coming new startups and the older system, if you will. Because I think increasingly during this time of AI, data driven, and everything happens so quick. So I think everyone's searching for answers in terms of how do you make sure the governance works, the KYC, the regulation, and all that. And then there's so much nuance and history, as well as the brand that we've built over time. So we're really trying to make sure that we can offer some value there to any of our partner and investee companies.
Again, congratulations on the performance of the venture debt fund, and I think the continued kind of expansion of this vehicle across multiple geographies. I think even in Southeast Asia, venture debt wasn't really a thing until maybe 5 years ago around the pandemic, when equity funding really took a hit, and startups had to look for other pathways for financing. And folks like Mars were there already to provide that option. And so, how do you see that option for venture debt, or even just pure debt, as a pathway for startups these days? You did mention Mars serving as a bridge between startups and more established companies, growth companies looking to IPO. But even for the earlier stage guys, how do you see that pathway evolving for, say, for example, if you're a business that does deals primarily with lending, or say you're like an e-commerce aggregator that you need a lot of like capital injections and things like that. Would debt suffice from that perspective, depending on the business model? How do you see that evolving?
So having us on the capital table offers again, our experience. And so I used to wear t-shirts and jeans for the full year, but as an entity and investor, we can't change who we are. So we're pretty tight when it comes to governance, KYCs, right? Regulation, and some industries, whatever service you provide, if your client is in certain category, and they're regulated, right? And so these days, for us, banks, for instance, third party risk, TPRM management is a big focus for the regulators, right? Any one of the institutions, and again, if they're your clients, right, they're tasked with making sure their vendors do the right thing and don't spread around the secret information, governance, and all that, right? We can certainly be the advisor and sounding board when it comes to what are the expectations. We're being asked like 20 different questions and things never seem to progress. Are we okay, or do they just hate us? Okay, they don't. Okay, we can tell you from our experience, okay, they're probably doing what's right for them and what they're required to do. So I think there are tons of different nuances, perspectives, and part of the reason that many of the successful fintech services or services that serves these institutions are run, founded, or advised by ex-bankers and industry veterans. In my view, maybe more in this area in APAC, right? It's a small world. We bump into ex-bankers and people who we know all the time, and there's a reason. And so I think the structure of the market, how do we, in terms of growing this environment, government plays a bigger role, I think, in Japan as well as many of the Southeast Asia economies. So we see how active MAS is, for instance, in Singapore, and we work with them on many fronts, many projects, right? I even saw that in Paris, France. So I was in this Viva event, maybe some of you know, in Paris, and they also sponsored heavily by the French government. President Macron used to be their AI or startup minister 12 years ago, I think. So that's when they started that. And then the sponsorship relationship between the large corporation, Louis Vuitton, many of their prominent French companies do come in and support the startup ecosystem. So that's a similarity there in these markets. And any government and regulators really want their country's startup ecosystem to be vibrant, and they want to support it. But whenever those large corporations and government steps in, gets involved, there are certain expectations of your behavior and your governance and all that. I think it frankly may affect the speed of development, but I think again, it's in a way good thing because you're doing things right first time round rather than coming back to get things under control
Right.
after things go wrong. So I think all in all that there would be some benefit learning from having us involved, letting us help you either through financing or investing, or even just a advisor to your clients and so on.
I really love how you reframed this whole conversation around thinking beyond just the capital itself and what value can be derived from simply being a part of the network that you guys have built. And speaking of the importance of the role of government and corporate, laying down the foundations, as you mentioned, how do you see that with respect to Japan and ASEAN for technologies like agentic AI, which you mentioned? I mean, Mars has had that kind of AI plugged into its fund before, but yeah, emerging technologies like agentic AI or blockchain, like how do you see this particular corridor kind of driving more innovation in those spaces moving forward?
So maybe two ways. One is, of course, the technology and knowledge exchange. Second is capital flow. First, the technology. As a Japanese, I'd like to think that Japan still has that edge and a lot of creative ideas and inventions really to sell into other markets. But we'll see. I think there's definitely a whole pool of deep research by the larger corporates, right? And again, because of some of the labor market situation, historically, those inventions have come from those corporate labs and researches. One area of which is the net zero, the environment, hydrogen technologies, and all that. So we're working really closely with the companies and the government as well to figure out how do we deploy that technology and how do we structure the finance towards the renewable electricity across the region as well. So there's some technology exchanges. And then in terms of capital flow, again, there's naturally a demand and interest from Japanese investors to go outside just because Japan itself is a matured market and just from the demography and sheer growth of the economy sometimes makes sense at least to diversify into faster growing markets. And then the other way around, of course, is, as I mentioned earlier, touched on the market reform. So Japanese market and companies in general are much more mindful of their capital return, ROEs, a little bit shorter term returns, right? And that's also important for the capital market as well. I think so. Yen rate is coming back a little bit. So all in all, I'm hearing a lot of interest from investors, outside investors. How can you approach Japan? And it's not always easy to look from outside and figure out how to solve Japan, if you will, right? That's, again, as the largest financial institution, we're trying our best to bring in the capital and then to offer good Japan investment opportunities for outside investors as well.
You did mention about, I guess, the nuances of investors coming in to quote unquote solve Japan. I wonder if you also have similar advice or other advice specifically for founders who are looking to work with Japanese corporates and banks like MUFG. What are some of the common misconceptions that they may have when it comes to building these relationships?
I'm not sure about misconceptions, but there's patient part, right? Again, it's not always a bad thing, right? We tend not to rush things, right? But once we set our mind to it, right? We go through the conversation, we get to know each other, we ask tons of questions, right? But when the time comes and something is decided, we're pretty longer term thinking and stable in terms of executing our agenda and our partnership. So that's one part of it. We tend to like to keep things clean, right? So a lot of governance on the onset. So I think on that point, it might help to have those mature investor or advisor even on your supporting ecosystem who has dealt with this kind of regime, the expectations, how do we go about structuring those what's called governance. What is it? It's not that difficult, just doing things in the right order. I think the revolution, AI revolution, also is coming to that part of our work. Yeah, I think it helps you to digest and then translate for you what does it mean to crack open, if you will, the Japan market. So of course, us as MUFG, we also try to be that partner, and we also have banks, securities firms, a trust bank, investor services, all these different functions, and we can combine that. So once, and it could be other reputable institutions, it might be much easier if you have that key partner, key Japanese partner among your board table, or again, advisor or partner, right? And then once people see the name there, oh, MUFG, okay, let's listen, let's talk. I think we've tried to build that kind of brand and trust that's valued by the fact that we teamed up or with certain startup business, or we're partnering with a certain business. I think we've built a certain reputation as well as experiences in dealing with many of such investors.
Yeah, I guess really making that initial, putting that foot in the door, so to speak. And I think looking at things really from an ecosystem perspective, like how can one sort of relationship lead to another, and so on and so forth. You did mention something interesting about governance and AI, and I wonder like what your thoughts are for earlier stage startups that maybe have constraints on cash, talent, or even time, and what your advice would be for them in terms of developing that kind of governance and risk management, especially if they, for example, say set out to partner with you guys and expand to Japan, for example.
The chances are, I think, these are by definition oftentimes standardized. All these expectations, right? Sometimes it's rigid law or certain guidelines, guardrails, what do you call it? So that means chances are other peers have already experienced it, or there are people out there who's done it, seen it, or even was in the on the governance side of it. So I think again, and this requires some cost, maybe if you go external. But this is about you. I'm sure, I feel like you can buy time by going to external help. And then again, if you have such persons or such connection among your equity table, that means instant help because again, they're together on board with your business. I think, and you literally see those advisory board oftentimes if you go onto prominent startup website, right? They do put their names up as part of their advisory board. I can understand because it's both the direct help as well as again they people see on get onto your website, see their
Reputation, brand
right,
name.
yeah,
Yeah.
oh, I know this guy, my friend knows him, and that's where the connection and the trust building starts. Yeah, going external is never a bad idea. And then a lot of knowledge is built and held by the industry. I'm sure there's a whole industry for risk governance and certain part of the KYC as well. Of course, some of the services itself is trying to crack open the governance itself, let's say. Okay. In which case, of course, your main job is to go have a different look and maybe automate, maybe rationalize some of the processes, and that's all good. Because again, I think it's really ultimately good for everyone if we could do that. But that's where people spend a lot of effort and time and money. So I'm sure that in itself could become a good business as well if you're close to those supporters and investors.
There's a startup idea for those listening. Feel free to take it. And yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I'm sure there's folks out there who would definitely need that kind of service and really automate some of the back office work that goes into a lot of this compliance and governance. On that note, I just wanted to tie back things together before we head into our rapid fire round and ask, as somebody who's led several funds, the CEO for Mars and all that, how has being a CEO of these types of funds, which are very much looking at startups, fast growing companies with a lot of uncertainty around how they're set up and how they're growing. How has that influenced your own kind of view as a professional, as an investment banking professional, as a finance professional, especially in your current role now?
Yeah, I would say first of all, that was only last year, full year
Yeah,
of
still fresh.
being in t-shirts and jeans every day, having chat with investors and other startup CEOs. I really miss it, and it really told me a lot about, of course, the ecosystem itself, but about leadership and how the new opportunities are built, and it's really about really looking at the where the, it's easy for us, like a big bank or economist, to say X% GDP growth and all that. But these are where the growth actually ignites and happens, right?
Mm,
Even just talking with Indian startups, for example, they say if we survive 1 year, by just surviving, we're going to grow 20%. And of course, we're going to try to double, triple that. But that's the mindset and the reality when the whole economy is growing and your industry is going up and up. And yeah, it really tells you about really being on the lookout, always a lookout for new opportunities, new chances. And then at the same time, that was might be disrupting our own business, our core
mm.
business, the bank. So I'm also open to it, right? We want to be betting on both sides. But again, I also saw if a business is growing, that means ultimately it's got to be helping the whole economy or the consumer at least, right? So overall, and it should be a good thing. And
Yeah.
as much as we have invested in the whole economy, it always comes around and helps our shareholders as well. So I think hopefully they would approve us investing so much in what could be a disruption for our own business. But again, that's so I've seen the growth ignite as well as maybe the whole turning point of the finance industry. And how exciting is that?
And certainly, I think there are a couple of turning points happening right now as we speak. We've talked about AI, we've talked about green energy, we've talked about blockchain as well, and a lot of these things that are could be very consequential for the whole industry and really, I think, important to be looking at. But I think my main takeaway from this conversation is that you missed the shirt and the jeans.
Yeah.
But
And the coffee outside.
and a bit of-
Yeah, MBFC. Yeah.
On that note, I want to get into a rapid fire round. So just some quick questions, quick answers, short and sweet. First one is most memorable piece of advice given by a leader that you've worked for or with.
Yeah, I was a chief of staff for a long time, and someone
Mm,
said, okay, imagine having a third set of eyes, like a camera at the corner of the room looking at you. At any one moment, you could be almost taken into that moment, heat of the moment, right? Maybe you're depressed, overly optimistic, and all that. But his lesson was always to have that objective view, how you're doing today, right? To have that longer term or a stable perspective. And that would make you a better manager overall. So that was one that kind of stuck with me. Yeah.
yeah, no, that's great. It reminds me of another line of a great leader learns how to both look at a microscope and a telescope at the same time, which is, yeah, very similar. Last time failure has helped you as a leader.
Okay, I won't mention a specific occasion, but at one point, again, I was in charge of strategy, sitting at the head office and all that for a long time. I guess at one point I might have become like, so don't be a smart guy is my one word. Like, of course, you got to get down on knees, roll up your sleeves, and get to things, do things, get things done, and all that. And it's been said, Elon Musk says that, everyone says that. I think that was one lesson in hindsight, if I look at my career. But I'm really glad that I did just that
Mhm.
through being involved in the startup investment. Yeah.
How do you de-stress? Any particular activity?
This trip, this is Singapore. You jump in pool all year. I run after work, Marina
Right.
Bay with my
Yeah.
colleagues, play tennis. Yeah, all the sports.
Yeah. I think Singapore is a great place to be doing all of that. And finally, what piece of pop culture, could be a movie, music, book, has inspired you the most in your leadership?
Okay, this is a bad answer, but there was an old stupid movie called Major League, right? This is so American,
Yeah,
and
baseball
I,
and
I
all
went
that.
I went to junior high in New York, America. I
Mm,
worked 5 6 years in California, so you see, okay, how these Hollywood movies are made because they're like that. Okay, just and I think it's about mentality. Well, for one, I want to get relaxed and entertained when I relax. So that's one, not nothing complicated. But second one is there's always tomorrow. You hit the rock bottom, okay, you get into trouble. And then generally speaking, I guess it well either fits my personality or being grown up in America shaped my personality. But in any case, it's okay, there's always tomorrow and things are not going to kill you. Okay. I can see maybe if you're a startup running it, you feel everything's against you. Okay,
mm.
this is the end of the world. It's not. It's not going to kill you, hopefully. Almost never, right? And there's always ways to come back in. You just get it as it is, stand up, and tomorrow will be another day. I guess
Right.
that's the mantra, and then that's what I took away from that stupid movie.
I mean, that stupid movie led to a mantra that I guess has really manifested in your career over the last more than 20, nearing 30 years, right? And doing all these things and continuing to be active in the startup ecosystem, especially more recently. Yeah, kudos to that. And thank you once again,
Okay.
Abe-san, for joining us on this call and a great conversation. Thank you for sharing,
Yeah.
being very candid about all your stories from your Stanford stories to the whole SVB saga, very interesting stuff, and all the stuff that you're doing now to work with startups and innovation. So, yeah, thank you for it was great to meet you in Singapore. Hope to meet you again in person soon. But in the meantime, thanks for going on call with us.
Yeah. Thank you. Great to speak to you again. Thank you very much.